Hey there everyone, and welcome to another episode of D&D Horror Stories. In today's episode, we have a tale about a dungeon master that inserts a player's fetish into a game, much to the horror of the players. A story about a prospective player that throws up all of the red flags, and more. But first, Nipsey has a question to ask.
Remember to like, comment and subscribe. I really like this, Alice.
Me too, Nipsey. You got good taste. Anyways, let's get into the stories. DM Forces, My Fetish on My Group. By Reddit user, Ashamed Throwaway 13. Firstly, I would like to say that I'm using a throwaway for a reason. Specifically, my abhorrent sexual fetishes, which I admit to in this thread. I should start by confessing something. I have an incest fetish. Well, this story is starting out different. I cannot explain why, but I find incest really hot, and that, unfortunately, is the crux of this story. I admit it's mostly my fault, but it was still uncomfortable for me, as well as for my other players. The characters in this story are me, playing a human bard. Our group's DM. She's actually a really good DM, in spite of what you might think of her based on this story. But she's the antagonist of the story, unfortunately. Fighter, a very good friend of mine, playing a half-elf fighter. Rogue, a former friend who played a human rogue. Wizard, another former friend who played a halfling wizard. Now, with the introductions out of the way, our story begins with a group of friends who started a group in college. For 3 years, we had an amazing game, which I could tell many much more positive stories about, and still have many good memories of. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to last. One night, after a game, a few of us went to the bar and I had a bit too much to drink. DM ended up driving me home, and during the car ride, my autistic ass confessed my incest fetish to her. This was something I had never done while sober, and was a massive mistake on my part. But at the time, I thought she reacted relatively positive. If only I knew how wrong I was. The next 2 sessions passed without issue, but I learned that there was issues back in my character's home village, and our party decided to investigate. By the time we arrived at my character's hometown, I had honestly forgotten about my drunken confession to the DM. Unfortunately, she hadn't. When we arrived at my character's hometown, we learned that a large portion of the village, including my character's father, had been kidnapped by a roving band of orcs. We, being a mostly good party, including my bard, who was very, very lawful good, immediately decided that we would go rescue the hostages. At this point, we were treated to our first mildly weird moment. Namely, my bard's mother being given a special scene where she holds him really close and talks about how much of a man her brave little boy has grown into. At the time, it was pretty innocuous, but in hindsight, DM put a disturbing amount of detail into it. Especially how large her bosom was, and how tightly she pressed against my character while hugging him. After this moment, we went to fight the orcs. It was a very difficult combat, but we enjoyed it a lot, and the boss fight with the orc chieftain was honestly incredible. Sadly, it was overshadowed by what came afterwards. When we went to rescue the prisoners, we had discovered that all of the men among the prisoners had been surgically castrated by the orcs. This already made all of us, except DM, uncomfortable, but only Rogue really spoke up about it at the time. In addition, when I asked about my character's father, we had learned that he had been sacrificed to the orcs' dark gods. The DM explicitly stated that this was after he had been castrated with the rest of the men. My character actually had a nice RP moment when our party found his father's corpse. He was utterly devastated. This had been the man who had taught him to approach the world with a smile on his face and a song on his lips, and he was gone. Not only was he gone, but he had been utterly humiliated, spit on, and stripped of dignity before his death. My character insisted on taking his corpse to town where he could be given a proper burial, and for some weird reason, DM seemed almost annoyed by this. After we got to town, the DM described to us how distraught the village women were to hear of their husbands, sons, and brothers' conditions. This was to be expected, But when she got to my character's mother's reaction to seeing her son exhaustedly carrying her husband's corpse into town, something changed, and it was noticeable to everyone at the table. She seemed to put more detail into her appearance than her emotions. I feel like it would be in very bad taste to mention specifics, but the phrase heavy bosom was uttered several times as the DM described my character's mother in her state of mourning over the man she married. It was honestly kind of disgusting, and I could tell that the other players noticed as well, though none of us said anything. The town folks held a celebration for us after our defeat of the orcs, but I made it very clear that my character wasn't really in a celebrating mood. He was drunk, but more to forget the horrific things that had happened to his father than out of any sort of merriment. Then, the DM made her move. She described my bard's mother walking into my character being half drunk and sullen in the tavern while everyone else was outside enjoying the festivities. The DM made it clear that she meant everyone, including the tavern keeper. We were alone together. Then, she told me how, while my character's mother was devastated by the loss of my character's father, she had been missing a man in her life, even before the orcs kidnapped him. I probably should have objected at this point, but I honestly didn't know what to do. Then, DM described my character's mother offering to soothe the pain for both of us, and starts taking off her clothes. While we'd already established that all of us were okay with not safe for work themes in the campaign, this was a bit much, and Fighter explicitly said that he was not okay with what was going on currently. Wizard and Rogue immediately said so as well, and I finally got the guts to speak up for myself. At this point, DM kind of freaked out a bit. Not by a lot. She didn't start screaming or burst into tears, but she got noticeably upset. She told us that the entire village subplot had been arranged because of me, and the incest thing had happened because I had told her that I had an incest fetish on the way home from the bar several weeks ago. I honestly don't remember much of what happened next. It was a screaming match, and being a naturally timid person, I hate screaming matches. What's worse is that a large portion of the screaming from everyone else, and I do mean everyone, was directed at me. I can't say it wasn't deserved, because this was my fault, but I was still really upset by it. In the aftermath, our group disbanded. Wizard will no longer talk to me at all, and Rogue says our friendship is over. Thankfully, Fighter is still friends with me. It's been 5 days, and I still haven't talked to DM. Fighter claims she had a crush on me, which I'm not sure if I believe, but it would explain a lot of her actions. I'm not really sure what to do, honestly. I know this is all my fault, but I'm not sure how to make amends. This has caused a huge fracture at our table, and even if we do somehow end up bringing it back together, I don't think things will ever be the same. I'd honestly really appreciate some advice, though I know that this isn't the purpose of the sub. Edit 1. Okay, this blew up a lot more than I expected it to, and while I wish I could respond to all, or at least most of the comments, that would simply take too much time. I am genuinely incredibly grateful for all the love, support, and advice I am getting in the comments. A lot of people seem to think that the reason Rogue and Wizard are mad at me is probably because they think I arranged this with the DM. I haven't asked them, but I find this very likely. I will talk to Rogue about this, as we are still on speaking terms, despite no longer being friends, and will also try to speak to Wizard. Also, while a lot of you are suggesting that I talk with DM, and that is a really good idea, I really don't want to talk to her right now. A few people, trolls I assume, are suggesting that I hook up with her, which, no thank you. Maybe I would have considered it before the events of the story, but after such a severe betrayal of my trust and confidentiality, I want nothing to do with her, and would want nothing to do with her romantically, even if we somehow managed to patch up our friendship. Well, that was certainly an interesting read. First, I'm not here to judge people's, let's say, proclivities. I just hope that OP doesn't pull a Chris-chan and act on it, and just keeps it at having an extra appreciation of Game of Thrones over the rest of us. But it is kinda messed up for the DM to do what she did. It's obvious that OP was drunk when he told her that, so she should have just assumed that it was in confidence and just kept it to herself. So, with OP saying that the whole event was his fault, I would disagree. Sure, it's his fault for telling DM, but her fault for doing what she did. But not only did she reveal it to the rest of their friends, but decided to do so via role-playing in-game. Here's hoping that OP and everyone else can patch things up, but I agree that it's probably best to not pursue DM in any romantic context. Or your family. Let's move on. Rollerblading Rick screened out of Shadowrun game before he could introduce us to his knife skills. By Reddit user, Cousin Ned. Disclaimer: this story contains unseemly characters, whose names have been changed as a courtesy to their disappointed parents. Recently, a few of our longtime gaming friends have moved out of state, leaving some holes in our Shadowrun group that needed to be filled. I turned to the internet, cause, that's what you do nowadays. Having heard the horrible stories of shitbag GMs, webcam masturbators, and cheeseburger fuckers that have been provided by the Happy Jacks fanbase, I decided that maybe I should meet any online recruits in public before inviting them to my friend's apartment. The group and I arranged to meet an internet person named Rick at a local diner. Before heading out, Rick texted me, saying, "Let me know an hour before you head out to the diner. I'm on rollerblades, and that's how long it'll take me to get there." That was red flag number 1. Why is that a red flag? Do just like the rollerblade. I mean, it was cool in the 90s. Just watch Hackers. I told the group that we ought to have a safe word in case Rick turned out to be awful. Naturally, we chose the horrendous game system that we all hate as our safe word, Palladium Rifts. If during the interview with Rick, any one of us started talking about not wanting to run the Rifts game, we knew that they were covertly exercising their veto power over this new player. We sit down for dinner, and I see Rick for the first time. He's got a long, nastily matted ponytail, and a backpack full of unsorted computer parts that he claimed to have purchased. Red flag number 2. Again, I don't see the issue. The computer parts, the rollerblading. Maybe he was a 90s hacker. He plops down wordlessly at our table. Red flag number 3. After a few awkward introductions, Rick takes over the conversation by saying, "Let me tell you a story about who I am as a player. And after I tell this story, you're either going to love me or you're going to hate me." That was red flag number 4. Rick's story involved him arriving at a Pathfinder game for the first time, and demanding to the GM that Rick have the opportunity to play himself in the game. That's 2016 Rick we're talking about here, lost in time and finding himself in a medieval setting. The GM begrudgingly agreed. We asked Rick if this was a good idea, seeing as how he'd presumably be underpowered next to all these actual fantasy heroes. Rick pulled out a harmonica out of his side holster and said, "I'm a real-life bard." He also said that 2016 Rick has real-life knife skills. We asked him if he had a knife, and he said, "Well, yeah." Red flag number 5. Yeah, now things are starting to get odd. Plus, I didn't realize it was 2016, so scratch my previous comments. According to Rick, the Pathfinder group was impressed with his antics. The GM and owner of the house, not so much, because Rick engaged in behaviors that seemed kind of burglary. Rick told us that he was constipated the night of his game and had to get up to use the bathroom about 10 times. Really? All those red flags mentioned before, and the oversharing of this information isn't one of them? On one instance, Rick got distracted by the homeowner's cat and chased him around the living room, much to the GM's bewilderment. On another instance, Rick ran out of toilet paper and began rummaging through the GM's drawers, also much to the GM's bewilderment. Finally, Rick had accidentally engaged the bathroom lock before closing it from the outside, so that no one could enter. The game wrapped up, and afterwards, Rick's got a text from the GM. Rick actually showed us the conversation, and I was horrified. It went something like this. GM, 10:45. "Rick, I'm sorry, but after tonight, I don't think I can trust you in my house. I hope you understand, and good luck finding a new group." Rick, 10:50. Wow, that's surprising, but I get it. GM, 11 o'clock. Thanks for understanding. Rick then sent the GM 6 multi-paragraph long, rambling psycho ex-girlfriend style texts over the course of the next few days, which included unsolicited phone numbers to Rick's character references, who would vouch for Rick's integrity. At this point, I was terrified of Rick, who was sitting a little too close to me in the diner booth. Rick leaned in and told us how he was going to get back into the GM's good graces. The first step of Rick's plan is to have his friends show up at GM's house, unannounced, and describe to GM why Rick is such a good guy. The second stage of Rick's plan, well, this is when things go from what the fuck to full-blown batshit. Rick intends to show up at GM's house on the day of his game and play his harmonica outside on the sidewalk as a form of protest. Rick described this as, "I'm protesting you so that you will learn to be my friend." Rick believes the other players, having recognized Rick and his enjoyable antics from the previous game, would come out to join his protest. GM would thus have no choice but to let Rick play. I'd long since stopped counting the red flags. At this point, I blurted out, "Rifts. I'm thinking about running an online Platinum Rifts game. After dinner." I blocked Rick's number and deleted the account from the website I used to find him, so that he couldn't track me down on his rollerblades and introduce me to his real-life knife skills. The moral of the story is, screen any new recruits before letting them into your game. Horror stories are real, and they are caused by everyday psychos like Rick. Well, I'd say that story definitely took a strange turn. It still surprises me to this day that there are people out there as delusional as Rick. Did he really think that playing his harmonica outside of a stranger's house would cause the other players to come out and join him in protest, to force the DM to let him back into the game? That's just crazy. I wonder if he actually went through with it though. Who knows, maybe we'll see that horror story posted one day. One can hope. And it looks like we have time for one more short story. But before we get into that, I have to ask that if you're enjoying the video, that you click the like button, as it helps with the algorithm and all that. And it makes Ziggy happy.
Hello. Hello.
Now let's get into the final story of the day. My backstory wasn't worthy. Submitted to the d&DDoge subreddit by Reddit user Scrudgemeyer. So, seeing another post here on the Doge's subreddit about a backstory that ended before it really began, I was reminded about how my backstory was considered unworthy of the DM's attention. This was Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, and I've had this tune sitting in my character file folder since then. I was invited to a table when people were talking about what classes to play, and no one seemed to be interested in Cleric. I don't mind them, because when played right, you can be an effective combat class that can put your own ass back together when the kobolds start gnawing at your knees. I decided on Rethwin, Macanosta, Rethwin, son of the innkeeper, a dwarven cleric. I was so tired of the old, even back then, trope of the edgelord backstories and wanted a more realistic story. Something that could happen, and something that would explain why I'm on the road adventuring. All the while not being the, "I'm the most awesomest, even though I'm level 1, and would likely wet myself at the sight of a single goblin in the middle of the road with a menacing scowl on his face" sort of player. So he was intended to be the third son of his father, the innkeeper. In a lot of fantasy books, a father wants an heir and a spare. One son to inherit, one to be the spare in case the first one dies, and then the rest should be girls, so the father can get their dowers when they are married off, increasing the family wealth. In my case, the eldest son inherited the farmlands that were his mother's dower since he didn't have a head for running an inn. The next son, who does not have a head for the business, was getting the inn. Rethwin got the hind teat. There was nothing left, save for his great-grandfather's axe. So thinking that he wanted to see the world, there was only one place that would train and equip him to send him out on his way. A church that has an order that trains adventurers to go out and be roving troubleshooters, and spread the word of their god to the ones they helped, and ones looking for a god that actually sent folks to help, unlike their own gods. Kinda skeezy of them, but religion is a cutthroat business at times. Thus backstoried, I presented the character to the DM. He looked at it and sniffed dismissively. I asked if there was a problem, and he said that with a boring backstory like that I'd just be a healbot in his campaign. I put Rethwin in my folder and noped out of the game before Session 0 started. I was able to dust him off in my current DM's campaign, who looked at the story and said, "Thank God, you actually have a backstory I can work with," gave me a wink, and said that my axe was slightly magical, but hasn't revealed that in game yet. And he's now 5th level and starting to get into his stride. Not sure why that first DM thought that the backstory wasn't good enough. Not every character needs to have an edgy, tragic backstory to be part of a party. In fact, a lot of the best characters can come from humble backgrounds, and OP put a lot of thought into that character's backstory. Any good DM would see that and work it into the game, and thankfully, OP eventually found such a DM. But that's going to do it for today. If you have a story that you would like to be featured in a video, be sure to link it in the comments below, or post it to the d&Ddoge subreddit. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all of your rolls be natural 20s. Until next time.